My name's Eddie Bartley, by the way. I'm a member of the Yerba Buena Chapter Board, the California Native Plant Society, and it's my sincere pleasure to welcome Jesse Miller. Jesse's an ecologist interested in the effects of global change factors such as altered fire regimes on plant and lichen communities. He worked as a botanist and ecologist in Oregon and California for several years prior to completing his PhD in the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he studied the effects of habitat connectivity on Ozark grassland plant communities. Luckily, he came back here and lives in San Francisco now. And he's currently a lecturer at Stanford, where he teaches ecology classes, including inquiry-based courses that engage undergraduates in real-world ecological research. So pleased to have Jesse back with us. He did an awesome program on lichens last June. And Jesse, can you share your screen with us, bud? You're muted.
Yeah,
there you are.
And are you seeing that now?
I am.
Excellent.
Technology is with us. Great. Thanks so much and welcome. Thank you for coming back to see us again.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me and thanks for the nice introduction, Eddie. And yeah, good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you all, such as the circumstances are. And I'm really excited to talk to you all about some of the research I've been working on lately, exploring a topic that's probably of interest to a lot of people, trying to understand how the changes in the way fires burn that we've been having in California are affecting biodiversity of native plants. So I just want to start off by acknowledging that wildfire in California is a complex topic, and it really lies at the intersection of ecology and politics and society. It's really multifaceted. And many people, and I'm sure many people who are joining us tonight have been personally affected by wildfire, or if not personally, almost all of us know someone who has. We saw some really intense fires this last summer, a lot of destruction of property. So I just wanted to start by acknowledging, I realize it's the social side of it in particular has been pretty severe in recent years. And I'm going to focus tonight on the ecological side of fire, which is, a mix of good news and bad news, I'd say. But to everyone who has had personal experiences and losses related to fire, I really, I understand that's a very intense thing, and my heart goes out to everyone who's been affected by it. So I think everyone who lives in California is aware at this point that we're living in an era when the way that fires burn is changing. And in particular, we're seeing larger fires in many different ecosystems. In certain ecosystems, we're also seeing hotter fires. In some places, we're seeing more frequent fires. While some places on the landscape are still experiencing less frequent fire than they did at one point. This is a figure just showing how the size of fires has increased over time. And it's really pretty striking, compared to the 1980s, how the size of fires has, almost quadrupled. Pretty striking change. And we see fire represented in the media a lot. And it's often in pretty drastic terms. These headlines are from Australia, but we've seen similar stuff in headlines in California and many other parts of the world. So, we often perceive fire as this very destructive force. And of course it is destructive to human settlements. It burns down houses, it causes a lot of damage, it alters people's lives. But tonight I want to focus on how fire is affecting our ecosystems in California and native plants, And as a contrast to these, very dramatic headlines talking about all the damage that fire does, we often see fire equated as completely eliminating an ecosystem. I think a great example was when Big Basin burned this summer. There were all these headlines saying Big Basin is gone, the redwoods are gone, and all the ecologists were saying, that doesn't seem like what we'd expect. Redwoods are probably the most fire-resistant tree in California. It seems like a bit of a stretch to just say the redwoods are gone in Big Basin. And then it turned out, once people actually got in there, a lot of the redwoods did survive in Big Basin. But then, on the other side from these headlines, we also see headlines saying, well, fire is actually good. Like, everyone was wrong. It turns out fire is actually good. And usually it's posed as kind of the lone scientific savior type perspective, where one man has discovered that fire is actually good. And we'll see, these stories explaining how fire is actually good. And so tonight, what I'm hoping we can do is move beyond the simplicity of fire is bad or fire is good, and try to get into the nuance a little more of how fire is actually affecting the ecosystems around us. Because it really is more nuanced than just saying it's good or bad. And it's really contingent upon where you are, because fire acts differently in different parts of the world, and even at a very fine scale within different ecosystems in California. And the concept I want to introduce, which is probably familiar already to a lot of people here, is the concept of fire regimes, or recurring cycles of fire. And almost every terrestrial ecosystem experiences fire at some frequency and at some severity. And the plants that live in a given ecosystem have been filtered by the fire regimes that characterize that ecosystem historically. And typically we characterize fire regimes or recurring cycles of fire by the frequency at which fire returns, so how often fire occurs, and also the severity of fire. Fire severity is the effect that fire has on the vegetation. And in general, these two factors are inverse. So if we have more frequency, if fire burns more often, we have lower severity, because there's only so much fuel at a given place that can burn. So if it burns more often, there isn't as much fuel to burn in general. And so the concept of fire severity is really important to understanding fire regimes. And in forested ecosystems, this is characterized based on tree mortality. So a high severity fire is a stand replacing fire where the trees die, or where most or all of the trees die. And a low severity fire is typically a ground fire where most or all of the trees survive. And when we zoom out to look at fire regimes in the Western United States, we can see there's actually a really broad spectrum of different fire regimes. And these are historical fire regimes. So these are how we think fire burned prior to European settlement in the Western United States, Western North America. So just to highlight a few trends here, you can see that in low elevation ecosystems, there's a lot of this teal color and the yellow color. And so these are fire regimes that are characterized by fairly frequent low to moderate severity fire. So for example, here in the Bay Area, we believe that fires occurred quite frequently, and they had a relatively low impact on vegetation. So a lot of the trees survived. And when you think about fires we've had recently in the Bay Area, like this summer, that's actually still more or less the case. We have these fires which cause have caused a great deal of damage to houses and other structures. But when you look at how they actually affect the vegetation, the oak woodlands of the Bay Area have largely survived recent fires. So in the Bay Area, the fires we're experiencing currently are in some ways fairly analogous to the kinds of fires that we think have occurred here for the last 5,000 years at least. But then you look at some higher elevation ecosystems like the High Sierra here, stretching from Lake Tahoe south. And that's the other end of the spectrum. That's where we get very occasional fires. Sometimes it'll be hundreds of years between fires, but when they burn at high severity. So those are stand replacing fires where most of the trees are killed. And you can also see moving north, we also have some of those same zones along the coast. So we get these really high severity fire regimes at high elevations and in coastal ecosystems. And it probably is not surprising to hear that different trees have different levels of ability to resist fire. So some trees have evolved to live in ecosystems with very frequent fire, while other trees have evolved to live in ecosystems where fire is relatively rare, but where it's very intense when it does happen. So some familiar species here, I'm sure to many people. So redwood is actually what we can consider our most fire adapted tree. And our yellow pines, ponderosa pine and Jeffrey pine, giant sequoia. These are all trees that have really thick bark and are often able to survive fire. And then as we go down this chart, we get into some intermediate trees that have a little bit of ability to resist fire, but these are often the species that become more abundant when fire is suppressed. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have tree species that really don't tolerate fire at all. These are the trees that are often killed after fire. And some of these occur in ecosystems that experience fire very rarely, like deserts or subalpine forests, which do experience recurring fire, but not very often. So we can think of the spectrum of historical fire regimes in relation to elevation, which doesn't perfectly capture the variation, but it captures a lot of it. So at lower elevations, we have ecosystems like oak woodlands and yellow pine and mixed conifer forests. These are the ecosystems that had pretty frequent fire historically, as often as every few years, perhaps. We sometimes describe these as fuel-limited ecosystems, where basically fire burned as often as fuel could build up to burn. But the climate was really good for fire, and is really good for fire in these ecosystems. They're relatively warm, they're relatively dry, or at least they're dry for enough of the year that there's time for them to burn. And then at higher elevations, we have ecosystems, you get up into the red fir zone and then subalpine forests. And these are sometimes called climate-limited ecosystems, where the climate is often cool and damp. And so conditions for fire that are good for fire occur relatively rarely. And so by the time fire does occur, a lot of fuel has built up and the fires burn really hot. But of course, human activity has altered the way that fires burn in California and all over the rest of the world. And among many changes, some of the most important changes humans have caused include more frequent fires in some ecosystems and more severe fire in some ecosystems as well. And it's, to put it all together, there are a number of factors that relate to this, which is something that makes understanding fire a little bit complicated. We can't point to just one thing and say, this is why fire has changed. But there are several different interconnected things that are actually part of the story. And these include historical fire suppression. So humans prevented fire from burning across much of California for the last century, or even a little bit more than that. We've also really altered the forested ecosystems around us by harvesting old growth timber. So most of the old growth trees have been removed, and that really changes the way fire burns. There are also many more people living in rural areas, and not just living in rural areas, but living in highly flammable structures in rural areas than there used to be. And then we're also living in an era of climate change, of course, which creates drier conditions. You know, higher temperatures lead to greater evaporation, so fuels are drier, and snow can potentially melt earlier. There are a number of different ways that climate change can lead to more fire or more intense fire. But there's this tendency to want to simplify the story And we often see people focusing on maybe just one of these pieces of the puzzle when we try to explain what's going on. So here's a photo of Gavin Newsom, our governor from this summer. So does anyone want to take a guess at what Gavin Newsom was talking about in this photo? You can put it in the chat if you have a guess. Yeah, climate change. Yeah, I'm sure many people are thinking this. Yeah, every time he talked about fire, he'd talk about climate change this summer, right? Hair gel, yeah, maybe, maybe that. Yeah, so Gavin really focused on climate change when he'd talk about fire, and he's not wrong. We're getting some great responses here. Yeah, climate change is a significant piece of the puzzle. But it's also the thing that's hardest to do anything about, right? And so a cynic might say, Gavin Newsom is focusing on climate change because it's easier than focusing on forest management, and it's certainly easier than trying to regulate the real estate industry, than trying to promote, building codes that require people to build structures that are more resistant to fire, like almost every other fire-prone country in the world does. We're really one of the only places that has very lax building codes when it comes to flammability, at least for Mediterranean climates. A cynic might say that. I'm just sharing a neutral perspective here. But let's talk a little bit more. In particular, I want to focus on historical fire suppression and historical timber harvest and how those have changed ecosystems in California. And then I'll go on to talk about some research I've been doing lately. We will bring this back to native understory plants here in a little bit, after just a little bit more background. So we had old growth conifer forests throughout a substantial part of California historically. And the thing about trees is the bigger they are, the more fire resistant they are, all else being equal. So if you look at the thickness of the bark on this old redwood, the bark is, maybe a foot thick. It looks like it's about as thick as those guys' head. So this is a very fire resistant tree. If a fire came through this landscape, it's very unlikely this tree would be killed. And when you remove the really big trees, of course, you usually end up with small trees in their place, as well as brush. And small trees and brush are much more flammable than big trees. So it's kind of an interesting scenario because we see people saying, oh, it's because we're not logging enough that we have all these problems with fire. And while there is a kernel of truth in that, it's more complex than that, because removing big trees is what commercial logging does, and that inevitably leads to more flammable landscapes. But in contrast, it can be beneficial to do some thinning of really dense young stands. If we go in and we thin dense young stands, that can reduce the severity at which fires burn, and it can allow the remaining trees to survive at much higher rates. So it's not to say that cutting trees is definitely part of the potential solution to the challenges we're facing with fire, but it's more of a restoration type thinning and not a commercial logging type thinning. But one of the other major challenges we're facing is that our forests have become a lot denser because of fire suppression as well as historical timber harvest. So we used to have much more open stands of conifers. And, on the left here, this is an example of a Jeffrey pine savanna in the Tahoe Basin. And then on the right, this is an example of what a lot of these ecosystems have come to look like. So this is a stand that's composed of mostly white pine. And white pine is a relatively fire-sensitive tree that's become a lot more abundant in the era of fire suppression because white pine is able to grow in the shade. So it springs up really readily when in the dense shade of fire-suppressed forest canopies. And just here's another photo just comparing a forest stand of giant sequoias in Yosemite, comparing 1890 and 1970. And you can see all these young trees have sprung up. And so we have a much more flammable landscape, probably largely because fire has been suppressed for so long. But the one really important thing to note is that the way that fire regimes have changed in California varies a lot between different ecosystems. So in chaparral, our charismatic California shrublands, we have the chaparral shrublands almost always burn hot when they burn. It pretty much top kills all the shrubs. And so fire severity hasn't changed, but we're just seeing more frequent fires in chaparral. In contrast, because of fire suppression, yellow pine and mixed conifer forests burn less often today than they did historically, but because of all the fuel buildup, they burn at higher severity. And then when you go up to higher elevations, we generally see a lot less departure from historical conditions. So in subalpine forests and to some extent red fir forests, we don't see much of a change in fire severity or fire frequency compared to how we think these ecosystems burned historically. But here's another illustration of just how much forests have densified because of fire suppression. So this image on the left is a map of a forest stand in 1929. And so all the yellow areas are gaps between trees. And you can see that by 2008, all those gaps had filled in with little trees. We don't have any really major gaps that could support grasses and native wildflowers that we used to have in these ecosystems. So I think, you know, the first point I want to make as far as how fire has changed native plant communities is that fire suppression has really altered native plant communities and reduced the abundance of grasses and forbs that historically were a much bigger part of these conifer forests. When we walk into conifer forests in California today, they're often deep, dark forests without a lot going on in the understory, but historically these were much more open stands, not everywhere, but you know, in low elevation yellow pine and mixed conifer forests, these were more open stands with much more abundance of wildflowers and grasses, graminoids in the understory. And because of these increases in fuel loads, we have a lot more high severity fire in low elevation conifer forests. And low is relative here. By low elevation conifer forests, I mean the entire range of Jeffrey pine, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, white fir, all those common tree species are what I'm talking about when I say low elevation here. And because of fuel buildup, when these low elevation conifer forests burn, they burn really hot. And we see huge areas of tree mortality. So this is a photo from the Angora fire in the Tahoe Basin. This fire burned in 2007. And this is what the landscape looks like today. I actually took this photo a few years ago, but it's still very similar today. So we saw this really large area of conifer forest be almost completely replaced by a shrubland. And because it burned so hot, there were no seed sources. So there was very little tree regeneration. And for the foreseeable future, this landscape is going to be a shrubland. And there's not a terribly high diversity of other native plants. The shrubs, of course, are native. But as far as like native wildflowers and graminoids, there's really not a lot going on there. And this is just another image to illustrate the kinds of wildfires we're getting in these low elevation conifer forests today. So the red here is areas that burned at high severity. This is the King Fire that burned along Highway 50 several years ago. And we had an area many miles wide of high severity where barely a single tree survived. And then in contrast, this is an example of a much smaller fire from an area in the Illilouette Basin in Yosemite that is where fire has been restored to something like its historical frequency. And so we see much smaller fires and much smaller high severity burn patches. Of course, there's always been some high severity fire in these ecosystems, but there's a lot more high severity fire today than there used to be. At least that's what we think. But one really important point here is that this pattern of increasing fire severity is what's going on in low elevation conifer forests, but it's not going on in every California ecosystem. And this is something that we see get confused sometimes. you know, especially when we see media coverage of fires. So for example, high elevation forests like subalpine forests have not undergone major shifts in fire regimes. They're still burning at about the same frequency and severity that they have for millennia, as far as we know. And similarly, in some of our other low elevation ecosystems like grasslands and oak woodlands and chaparral, we don't see this same kind of intense fuel buildup. You know, there may be a little bit of fuel buildup in these ecosystems, but we don't see this very rapid fuel buildup the same way that we do in conifer forests, you know, in general. And as a consequence, the fires that we see in oak woodlands, for example, are much more similar to the way that they've always burned, we believe. So, you know, if you've walked around in the North Bay in areas that burned in 2017, or any other year for that matter, but I was recently out at Pepperwood in the North Bay, the Pepperwood Preserve, looking at areas that burned in the Tubbs Fire, and you know, almost all the oaks survived. I mean, we saw, you know, maybe 10% oak mortality or something like that, but the oaks have really thick bark and survive quite well, in part because there's not this massive fuel buildup. And even in places where houses burned down, often the trees surrounding the houses were still alive after those North Bay fires in 2017. So this is a really important nuance that often gets lost. So my warning is be wary of statements that broadly cast all California vegetation as overgrown, because, you know, we've always had highly flammable shrublands. You know, that's just the nature of chaparral. Chaparral is highly flammable, but that's nothing new. We've always had chaparral shrublands. So anyway, I'll get on to talking about some of my actual research, looking at plant communities and fire, now that I've given that highly compelling background. So the main question that I've been investigating for the last years is how do altered fire regimes affect biodiversity? And particularly looking at these areas in low elevation conifer forests where fire severity has really increased. I've been very curious about how this is affecting the diversity of wildflowers and graminoids that grow in the understories of these forests. And while a lot of fire ecology research focuses on trees and tree regeneration, as you know, I'm obviously preaching to the choir here, but you know, it's really important to look at the whole diversity of plants on the landscape, because we know that these plants play some really important ecological roles. And if we lose our plant diversity, that's something, you know, really major that we should be thinking about, you know, how these plants are actually changing as we alter fire regimes. And another reason why understanding how plants are responding to fire severity is we do have some ability to influence how fires burn. So when we think about these really dense forested stands where tree density has increased because of fire suppression, if we go in and we thin these stands before they burn, they will typically burn at a much lower severity. We have pretty solid science backing that up at this point, but resources to do this are limited, so we have to know where we want to actually go in and do this kind of management. So ecologists, you probably won't be surprised to hear that ecologists have developed some theories about how fire affects biodiversity. And probably the best known of these is the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. So in this graph, the x-axis is fire severity. So unburned is the left side of the axis, and then high severity or stand replacing fire is the right side. And then the y-axis is how plant species richness responds to fire. So the intermediate disturbance hypothesis suggests that we should see hump-shaped responses to fire severity. So we would see the highest diversity in places that burn at moderate fire severity, at least at sites that are moderately productive. And then it also suggests that at sites where productivity is really low, so where there's not a lot of plant biomass, like really dry ecosystems like deserts, in these places, fire would basically just be bad for biodiversity because the plants aren't really competing to begin with. So there's no benefit to plants from having their competitors removed. And then at the other end of the spectrum, in high productivity sites, like say a really dense rainforest, for example, we would expect to see just a few highly competitive species. And so any kind of fire would reduce competition and would release more plant species and increase diversity. So this is an intriguing theory. It seems like there's something to it, but it turns out when we look at real world data, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis doesn't really explain what's going on with plant communities very well. There was one review paper several years ago that found that these hump-shaped relationships, which are expected to be the most common kinds of relationships by this theory, only occurred in 16% of the studies they reviewed. And one thing this study doesn't, one thing this theory doesn't really explicitly examine is, or consider, is the fact that plants can have many different kinds of adaptations to fire. And we already talked about this a little bit. I showed that figure showing how the different how some conifers are very fire resistant and other conifers are very flammable. But we can expand this to think about herbaceous plants as well. And so this is a field of prickly poppies that I photographed on the east side of the Sierra the year after a fire burned. This is just kind of on the other side of the hill from Yosemite. And these prickly poppies probably have seeds that germinate, their germination is cued by fire. And so that's why we see this large field of prickly poppies growing. So fire-cued germination is one example of a way that herbaceous plants can be adapted to fire. Another example is that a lot of plants can have underground structures that allow them to resprout after fire. And some of our shrubs are a really good example of this. Some of our shrubs can burn off in a fire and then resprout the next spring. Of course, we're seeing that happening all over the Bay Area right now in areas that burned. And so if we think about this in the big picture, we would expect that the group of plants that grow in a given region should have adaptations that reflect the historical fire regimes in that region. So if that region historically had frequent low severity fires, we'd expect that plants would be adapted to do well under that kind of fire regime, because that fire regime filtered for those kinds of plants over centuries and millennia. And so a hypothesis that I came up with in collaboration with Hugh Safford, kind of in contrast to the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, was that we would expect that in ecosystems that had frequent low severity fire, we'd expect plant species richness, or the number of plants in an area, to be maximized after low to moderate severity fire, which is the kind of fire that historically occurred most frequently in these ecosystems. In ecosystems that were more intermediate, where they had a kind of a range of different fire severities historically, so this would be more like our red fir type ecosystems, partway up the mountain, but not all the way at the top. We'd expect to see more of a leveling off type relationship, where diversity is maximized at moderate to high severities, but is probably the very highest at moderate severities. And then we expected that at the highest elevation type ecosystems, like subalpine forests, where there was historically very infrequent high severity fire, that there would be more of a positive relationship between fire severity and plant species richness. So we'd see really high we'd see more plants in areas that burned at really high severity. So this was the idea we came up with to try to explain what's going on with patterns in the real world, with how fire is affecting biodiversity. And so to test this pattern, we went out and we sampled plant communities in a couple different forest types. We looked at low elevation conifer forests, which I've been talking about. So these are yellow pine and mixed conifer forests. These are the ecosystems that historically burnt frequently, but mostly at low or maybe mixed severity. And then we compared them to plant communities growing at higher elevations in red fir forests. And red fir forests burned less frequently. We could say intermediate frequency, intermediate severity. They didn't burn at quite such high severity as subalpine forests, but they're on their way up there. So we went out and we looked at plant communities in both these forest types to compare them and see if this supported our hypothesis. So we expected that more species would be present after high severity fire in forests that historically had more high severity fire, which is the red fir forest. And we also expected that we would see more evolutionary diversity of plant species after high severity fire in these same ecosystems that historically had a lot of high severity fire. And so this is a concept that's sometimes referred to as phylogenetic diversity, which is kind of a technical term, but it basically refers to the amount of evolutionary variation within a plant community. And so these diagrams here are phylogenies or evolutionary trees. Oops. And so each of these little circles represents a plant species. And so if you look at this tree on the left, you can see that these three plants are all branching off of the same part of the tree. And so these are three closely related plants. And then over here on this other tree, these three plants are much more distantly related. So we'd call this tree on the left a community with low phylogenetic diversity, and we'd call this tree on the right a community with high phylogenetic diversity. And so we expected that there would be more lineages that are adapted to high severity fire at these higher elevation ecosystems. And then there's one last piece in this puzzle, and then I'll tell you what we found. So I mentioned earlier that we're seeing this pattern of increasingly homogeneous fire severity patterns. So in lower elevation conifer forests, we're seeing large areas that burn at pretty consistently high severity. So we have these large areas where trees are almost entirely removed. So one thing I've been curious about is how heterogeneity in fire severity at a landscape scale affects plant diversity. I've gone out and I've walked around in these areas that burned at high severity, and there's very low plant diversity. So I've wondered if areas burn more heterogeneously, does that lead to higher severity? And so ecologists sometimes refer to heterogeneity in fire severity as pyrodiversity. So if there's more heterogeneity in fire severity at a landscape scale, that's a more pyrodiverse landscape. But I'll illustrate what I mean by that. It might be a little clearer if that's confusing with this diagram. So if you imagine these three different landscapes represented by circles, on this diagram, red represents high severity fire and blue represents low severity fire. So if you imagine a landscape composed entirely of high severity fire versus a landscape that's a mix of different fire severities, you could imagine there might be greater plant diversity in the landscape composed of a mix of different fire severities, right? So to test that, I calculated the amount of heterogeneity in fire severity surrounding the areas that we sampled in this study. So that was my last hypothesis. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I have several wonderful collaborators who helped out with this work. This was really a team effort. So thanks to these people who are mostly at UC Davis and the US Forest Service, except for Daijong Li, who's at Louisiana State University. And so to explore these hypotheses, we sampled 9 different fires in the Sierra and up on the Modoc Plateau in the Warner Mountains, ranging from 5 to 15 years after fires. We sampled about 370 different study plots, individual study plots. One real limitation of previous research is that a lot of people have done studies just focusing on a single fire. So our goal was to try to sample a lot of different fires and get a broader sense of how fire is affecting landscapes, that's not restricted to just a single local area. So to do this, we went out into areas that had burned in the last 5 to 15 years, and we established study plots across the landscape in each fire. And our study plots captured the whole range of fire severity. So from areas that burned at a low severity to areas that burned at a really high severity. And then to quantify pyrodiversity, I also calculated the standard deviation of the proportion of fire severity classes in 250 meter areas surrounding each fire. Slightly technical language, but basically just looked at how much diversity there was in fire severity surrounding the study plots. And so what we did was we went out and we established these big imaginary circles across the landscape. And then within each of those circles, we just walked around and identified all the plants that were growing in each plot. And so I'll show you what we found. But first, I'll just remind you of what we expected. So we thought that in low elevation conifer forests, in yellow pine and mixed conifer, that we'd see this hump-shaped relationship where diversity was highest after low to moderate severity fire. And then for the higher elevation red fir forests, we thought we'd see a less negative effect of high severity fire. So what we found for species richness was, sure enough, in yellow pine and mixed conifer forest, we saw more or less a hump-shaped relationship. So diversity was highest in moderate severity fire, but it was lower in the areas that burned really hot. So these are the areas where all the trees were killed and replaced by shrubs. And then it's also interesting to note that diversity was also substantially lower in unburned areas. And of course, in many cases, these are areas that have been fire suppressed for a long time. So they're probably, thicker, denser forests than they were historically. These moderate severity burned areas are probably the closest to what we could think of as the historical condition for these ecosystems. And they're substantially higher plant diversity. So we got an average of about 30 plants in a plot there, while it was only about 20 plants in a plot at unburned or high severity. In contrast, in the red fir forest, we did see more or less what we expected, which was that while diversity is still maximized at the moderate severity, the high severity fire doesn't have nearly as much of a negative effect on plant diversity as it did in the low elevation conifer forest. So we still have substantially higher plant diversity in the areas that burned at high severity compared to the unburned areas. Hopefully everyone's staying with me so far. Just a couple more graphs to show here. So that's species richness, or the number of plants growing in each study plot. And then the other prediction, just to remind you, was I expected that phylogenetic diversity, or the diversity of plant evolutionary lineages, would be higher in red fir forests than in yellow pine and mixed conifer. So in yellow pine and mixed conifer, there was a pretty distinct negative effect of fire severity on phylogenetic diversity or evolutionary diversity. So basically, there were a smaller number of evolutionary lineages that were surviving in areas that burned really hot compared to unburned areas. So fire seems to be filtering out, certain lineages can tolerate high severity fire, but other lineages do not seem to tolerate fire at all. In contrast, in the red fir forest, there was a little bit of variation, but none of these differences were significant. So basically, we just saw like a stable relationship in red fir. Fire severity didn't really affect evolutionary diversity in any substantial way, whereas there was this negative relationship in the lower elevation forests. So again, this is some evidence that these higher elevation ecosystems, the plant communities do seem to be more adapted to high severity fire, which is exactly what we expected. This actually, so to put it all together, this does seem to suggest that there really are differences in the ways that plant communities are adapted to fire in different ecosystems, and these do seem to correspond to the historical fire regimes or the way that fire used to burn in these ecosystems prior to European settlement in California. And I think this is actually really cool. This is what we expected, but it's kind of rare in ecology to actually get results that work out this cleanly. So I was very pleased to see and pleasantly surprised that our hypotheses were so well supported. Okay, so the last thing I predicted was that we'd see higher plant diversity with increasing pyrodiversity, or greater heterogeneity in fire severity at the landscape scale. And sorry, this is a little fuzzy, but so on the x-axis here, we have pyrodiversity, so the amount of heterogeneity in fire severity surrounding the study plot. And then on the y-axis, we have plant species richness. And sure enough, there was a positive effect, at least up to a point. So this kind of supports what we'd already observed just by walking around, which was when you have these really large, homogeneous, high severity burn areas, it's not really that great for plant diversity. When you have a landscape that's more heterogeneous after fire, it seems to support more plant diversity. And when we compare the effects of local fire severity to pyrodiversity or landscape scale fire heterogeneity, pyrodiversity was actually almost as important as local fire severity. So it suggests we need to think about how fire is acting, not just at a local scale, local fire severity, but landscape scale heterogeneity seems to really matter too. So if we can keep some living trees on the landscape, this can probably help prevent these just huge shrubland monocultures from forming. And that's going to maintain probably more open niche space for the wildflowers and graminoids that are such a cool part of our California ecosystems. The shrubs really don't seem to facilitate really highly diverse plant communities. Of course, shrubs are native plants. They have their place. I'm not saying we need to get rid of all shrubs, but perhaps we already have enough thousands of acres of shrubs in California. And retaining some of our long-lived trees is also a laudable goal, I would argue. So I'm getting to the end here, and I just want to wrap up with a few of my major conclusions and take-home messages. So in the big picture, I think one major take-home message from this is that returning fire to fire-adapted ecosystems will usually benefit plant diversity. Overall, we certainly see positive effects on plant diversity in California after fire. But not every ecosystem is ready to burn in its current state because we have really intense fuel buildups in some places. So it's the best thing we can do in these places is go in and remove some of the fuels or treat some of the fuels before we reintroduce prescribed fire. Since we don't want to create more of these shrubland monocultures with these high severity fires. At least that's my perspective. So there really is, in my perspective, a really major role for management, going in and thinning dense stands, removing fuels, and then using prescribed fire as a management tool. It's in my mind, and I think nearly every fire ecologist in California would agree, prescribed fire is an absolutely essential tool going forward. And it's one of the very best things we can do. And we need to be applying prescribed fire very widely, much more widely than we already are. Fire seems to affect plant communities at multiple spatial scales. So that's something we should think about when we're planning management activities. We have multiple lines of evidence now that these really large high severity burn patches in low elevation conifer forests lead to depressed biodiversity. So taking management approaches to prevent these from forming in the first place is one really good thing we can do. How do we actually do that? Thinning out the really dense stands. We know that reduces fire severity and promotes plant diversity, at least in these low elevation conifer forests. It wouldn't make so much sense in high elevation conifer forests. We don't really have a big problem up there. Things are doing okay at the high elevation forests. Heterogeneous fire severity is probably going to support the greatest biodiversity, although that remains to be explored a little more. And perhaps by thinning in kind of a patchy manner, we can create more heterogeneous forest structures that will in turn promote more heterogeneous fire burn patterns. And finally, to sum it up, our landscapes are going to burn, whether we like it or not. That's just inevitable. But if we want to, we have the ability to influence how and when fires burn. And using the option to influence how and when it burns is probably going to be to the benefit of our native plants and will help us preserve the wonderful biodiversity that we all love here in California. I certainly appreciate nature and letting nature take its course, but we have to recognize that humans have modified the landscape in just, very, very severe ways. And so going in and, doing some management and, controlling how fire burns is actually helping make up for some of the ways we've changed these landscapes in the past, I would argue. We're not interfering with nature, we're interfering with the interference with nature, is how I would see it. And of course, seeing humans as separate from nature is kind of a problematic construct in the first place, I would argue. We understand now that people have been managing fire in California for thousands of years, and we're simply continuing in that tradition. Anyway, so going back to these headlines, You know, we recognize that fire can be very destructive, can cause a lot of damage to people. But what I would like to see is, you know, when we have this public conversation about fire, we think about how different ecosystems are adapted to different kinds of fire. Because in my mind, that's really the lens for understanding what's going on. And the conversation is just going to be confusing and unclear if we don't consider how different ecosystems are, have historically had very different kinds of fire. So with that, I want to thank all my collaborators, people who've given me money, the wonderful students who've helped with my work. Really couldn't do it without all of them. Thanks to all of you for joining me and listening to this. And here's my contact info. I'd be really happy to hear from any of you. I really enjoy, you know, getting in touch with the community, talking to people about these very important issues. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Uh-oh, looks like you're frozen, Eddie, or maybe I'm frozen.
You are not frozen, Jesse. Yeah,
Oh, good.
But Eddie is. So we can roll through some of these questions. Someone asks, for the high severity burn sites converted to scrub, is there a restoration opportunity for replanting the lost trees?
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone wants to volunteer, you can go, you know, chop out the shrubs, plant some trees. No, but yeah, I mean, it's doable. It's just, you know, it's a lot of work. Once the shrubs are established, you know, it's just backbreaking work out in the sun. But yeah, if someone goes out and cuts down the shrubs and plants trees, it's certainly doable. I guess the take-home message is just that it would be much easier to do the forest restoration before it burns and keep that situation from happening in the first place.
In your opinion, what do you think is the most important thing the public should know about wildfires, especially from an educational standpoint? I'm an outdoor educator and work at a preserve that had wildfire in August 2020, and lots of people ask about fire. I've learned a lot about fire ecology since then, but I don't know what would be the most important takeaway when talking to the public about this topic.
Yeah, great question. Well, I mean, I guess maybe the number one message in my mind is just reminding people that California's ecosystems are almost all fire adapted ecosystems. So fire is natural. It's something we've always had. But then going on to the next level beyond that, also emphasizing just how different ecosystems have had different kinds of fire. And so fire can behave really differently in different places. And that's how it's always been. In my mind, those are, you know, really important messages that the general public is not necessarily really clear on. Like even, you know, the average college educated adult is not necessarily really clear on those really basic facts.
So what is the elevation range for these low elevation conifer forests that you're talking about?
I'd say like 2,000 to 7,000 feet or something like that. And of course, it depends how far north you are in the state. But you really, you know, I think of the low elevation conifer forest going until you get into red fir, and then red fir is more like mid high elevation forest. And they're, you know, usually by the time you're at like 7,000 to 8,000 feet, you're in red fir, at least in like the northern to central Sierra.
If the current fire severity frequency trend continues or worsens, what effects would you expect to see on conifer diversity? Specific species, groups going extinct or becoming more widespread?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's a tough question. So I don't think we're going to see any species going completely extinct in the near future. But, you know, what we're concerned about is seeing what we sometimes call biological homogenization, where, you know, at the local scale, we're losing our diversity, even if they're not entirely extinct. So one thing, you know, I mentioned that white fir has really become more abundant because of fire suppression. One interesting thing is that white fir actually, because it grows well in the shade, it actually comes back up. It's able to sometimes survive underneath those shrubs that form. And then you'll get white fir arising out of the shrubs. And historically, these are landscapes that would have had more yellow pine, but yellow pine can't grow in the shade of these shrubs. So we're getting this homogenization where we have like a whole bunch of white fir on the landscape. Incense cedar is another increaser after fire. It's a very fire intolerant species. There's probably 10 times more incense cedar in California today than there was 200 years ago. So yeah, that's a great question. We're definitely getting, a small number of species becoming more abundant, and some of our classic fire adapted species. Actually, I'd say though, if I had to pick one I'm most worried about, it's sugar pine. Sugar pine, there was some recent research showing that that we should be very concerned about the future of sugar pine, which is a very fire adapted tree, and it's dropping off pretty dramatically. So yeah, great question. And there's definitely some trends there.
What sorts of considerations do you feel have to be made with respect to endangered fauna when it comes to fire management?
Yeah, really good question. So I'm only a plant person. I don't think about animals. No, I'm just kidding, but it's kind of true. Well, it's actually, there are a lot of parallels when we think about plants and animals. We have some species that are old growth species that need, undisturbed old growth forest. We have other species that are fire followers that you're only going to get in recently burned landscapes. And then we have other species that are in between. So, we have a couple species of woodpeckers that, you find in burned areas, but then we have stuff like spotted owls, which need old growth forest, and they can tolerate, some degree of fire in old growth forest, but they're not going to survive in landscapes that are, with really high tree mortality. So I think it's just, we do have to have this full gradient on the landscape. The thing is, we're not in danger of not having enough burned areas. Like, there's no way we're going to run out of burned areas in California. That's not going to be a problem in the near future. Running out of like old growth forest is a much more, conceivable problem in our time spans. I mean, the way fires are going in the Sierra Nevada, we're looking at the possibility of losing trees from like, a high proportion of Sierra Nevada landscapes within our lifetimes. So yeah, those are the kinds of habitats I'd be concerned about for both animals and plants.
How well is NPS managing national forests in California? Yosemite as an example.
Well, so NPS is the Park Service, and so they manage national parks, not national forests. But so I guess I think they mean national parks. Yosemite the National Park Service is doing a great job, in my opinion. So Yosemite has this area called the Illilouette Basin. And basically the Park Service has allowed fires to return to their natural fire regimes there. So they get these summer monsoon storms with lightning. So lightning comes in and ignites fires in Yosemite. And the Park Service, to some extent, just lets these fires burn. And so what we're seeing is this return to the more or less the way that fires historically burned in this whole part of California, where we have these small fires that largely burn at like, low to moderate severity. It's a really cool thing. And so now scientists are using this as kind of a reference site to try to understand, the dynamics of how ecosystems used to be, much more broadly in California. So yeah, I definitely, I think that's really fantastic. And of course, the parks, they're not under a mandate to produce timber, so there's no conflict of interest there. If some of the trees burn up, it's not a big problem from their perspective. So yeah, some might say that capitalism is the real virus.
Well, someone wants to know if it would be possible to take seedlings from a close nearby healthy place and drop them into a recent burn in hopes of staving off the shrub monoculture.
Yeah, absolutely. The way we usually see it is you have like a 5-year window after the fire before the shrubs really form a dense canopy. And so the Forest Service does sometimes go out and plant trees in these areas. I mean, if you have small enough high severity burn patches, natural regeneration is totally possible. The thing is, for yellow pine, the seeds are big and they don't travel that far. So, if you have a small high severity burn patch, seeds can naturally seed in, the seedlings can grow back naturally. What one of my colleagues recently found was that it's once you get more than 80 meters into a high severity burn patch that the seeds don't seem to make it anymore. But yeah, going in, I mean, the window for tree planting, it's easiest if you do it in the first year or two after fire in these large high severity burn patches. Because, after that, you have to go fight the shrubs and remove the shrubs. At the beginning, if you get the trees in there quick enough, they can just grow. So yeah, and I know, people have a range of different opinions on, guerrilla gardening. And, I wouldn't advise anyone to go out and just be cavalier about planting stuff, but I wouldn't say that there's never a role for that either, personally.
Yeah, I wonder if say National Park Service would do something like that. I mean, that seems like it would take a thoughtful effort to kind of garden it in that fashion. I wonder if anyone's even doing that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's certainly replanting efforts, but as far as like, inviting volunteers out to work on it, I'm not sure if those kinds of opportunities exist, but that's the kind of thing we should probably explore.
Well, you've been mentioning some of the obstacles with fire, and you're saying money is a big obstacle. Having enough funds to do some of these prescribed burns might be an obstacle. But if someone wants to know, what are some political or structural barriers that are getting in the way of pronounced and coordinated prescribed fire efforts and management strategies, thinning fuel load, biodiversity restoration?
Yeah, no, great questions. That is really getting at the heart of the challenge we face. And there's been, there are papers analyzing this whole situation. I mean, there's such universal agreement that we need more prescribed fire, as well as some of these other actions that the questioner described. Yeah, why is it that we're only doing, such a relatively tiny amount of area burning in prescribed fire each year? There are a number of potential obstacles. Funding isn't necessarily the biggest obstacle. I mean, regulations are definitely one major challenge. We have all these air quality rules. And so, there are only certain days of the year with the right kind of air quality where you can burn. But of course, the irony is that even if you burn on a bad air quality day, it's still, much lower impact compared to the really severe wildfire smoke that we get. Because of course, inevitably that happens on the very worst air quality day, right? I mean, all of us in San Francisco remember, just a few months ago when we could barely go outside because the air quality was so bad. In retrospect, maybe it would have been worth it to do a prescribed fire in some of those areas on a marginal air quality day. But it's really a complex situation. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons, a lot of different potential limiting factors. But I guess, I would just like to suggest another way to reframe this is to look at who is successfully getting fires done right now and what are they doing, and how can we all emulate that? And I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of our indigenous communities in California have very successful prescribed fire programs, carrying on traditions that have been going on for millennia in a lot of these communities. In some cases, they're really cool collaborations between indigenous groups and the Forest Service. So I think we need to look at them and see what they're doing that's working so well and try to emulate that more broadly.
Someone wants to know about your study sites, and so do I. I'm interested because I always want to go to the Warner Mountains because I hear they have like 75 species of butterfly. Like, it's something just phenomenal, amazing. I want to see that. Someone says, how did you assess and score fire severity levels when you were picking your study sites?
Yeah, so what we would do is we would actually use fire severity maps. And so the way those maps are created is they take the amount of greenness in the vegetation before the fire and compare it to the amount of greenness in the vegetation after the fire. And so the more, basically the bigger the decrease in greenness is after the fire, the more severe the fire is. So basically, if all the trees are killed in an area, like almost all the greenness is gone, whereas if the trees almost all survive, there's not that big a change in greenness. So it's kind of a coarse estimate, but it gives you a general idea of where the high severity zones are and where the low severity zones are. So we would use that to select study sites. So we say, we're going to 5 high severity sites, 5 moderate, 5 low, whatever, to simplify it a bit. And then when we get out there, we actually analyze severity in a more detailed way. So we would actually look at tree mortality, and that's probably the strongest single thing. So, you know, if all the trees are dead, then it's high severity. If all the trees survive, it's low severity. But then there are other things we look at, like the height to which the boles of the trees are charred and stuff like that. So it's really a multivariate method for quantifying fire severity.
Do you have recommendations for managing Northern California chaparral for fire with type conversion?
Yeah.
Without type conversion.
I'm glad you asked that. Yeah, and so for anyone who's not familiar with the concept of type conversion, that's the idea that if chaparral burns too much, it basically turns into like a weedy grassland because the roots of the shrubs get exhausted and can't resprout anymore. Yeah, so that's a tough question because, you know, chaparral grows at low elevations where we historically had frequent fire, but if we have too frequent a fire, it's going to eliminate the chaparral. So what I would say is, you know, in the landscape surrounding chaparral, we should be doing prescribed fire because that's going to reduce the risk of uncontrollable fire moving through the landscape. But I don't think that doing prescribed fire is really appropriate in chaparral most of the time. I actually have recently worked on a study looking at lichen communities in old growth chaparral, and we found that there's some pretty special lichens that only live in really old shrubs. So yeah, I think if we can manage the rest of the landscape with fire, but try to maintain islands of old growth chaparral on the landscape, that's probably going to be our best bet. But it's a tough thing because a lot of chaparral fires are caused by you know, human ignitions, and it's, you know, how do you tell people don't go out and accidentally start fires in the chaparral? That's kind of a tough situation. So yeah, I don't have all the answers for chaparral.
Bob's gone mute, but I'm back.
Oh,
Right.
do you consider coastal scrub to be the same as chaparral when you're doing these studies?
I would say no. I think of coastal scrub as being kind of its own thing, but it's probably somewhat analogous to chaparral and being fire adapted. I don't actually know that much about coastal scrub fire regimes, but I would guess it might have had more frequent fire than chaparral. I'm not totally sure though. If anyone knows, comment on it in the comments.
We are trying to do some type conversion with that occasionally when the coastal scrub gets too thick and we're trying to save some of the grasslands that have all the forbs in them. We have to remove native species like coyote brush.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, that's something we sometimes forget is even though these are all native shrubs, we've seen a lot of grassland be converted to shrubland in the last few decades. And if anyone, you know, I like to hike on the Dipsy Trail up in Marin. And when you get to Cardiac up at the top there, there's that photo showing what the landscape looked like, you know, a century ago or something like that. And it's totally open grassland with like one big redwood or something like that. And today it's like Douglas fir forest and shrubland. You know, I think we really are seeing the loss of some of our grasslands to shrubs.
What kind of fire regimes can be expected with the new low diversity, high altitude scrublands?
Yeah, I mean, they're not exactly high altitude, but I think I know what they're asking. Well, I mean, what we're probably going to see is recurring cycles of high severity fire because when those shrubs burn, they burn hot. So we're going to see white firs growing up through the shrubs. We'll get these like kind of low diversity white fir shrublands, and then they'll burn again and they'll just start over and we'll get more shrubs and white firs. I mean, that's what we're afraid of, at least. That's the nightmare scenario where the entire Sierra Nevada, low elevation Sierra Nevada is just transformed to these shrublands with white fir that are kind of these monocultures that just burn and come back and burn and come back.
And let me know if you're getting exhausted with all the questions. There's
No,
some good
it's
questions.
all good.
Okay. What is the effect of bark beetle infestation on fire intensity and plant diversity?
That's a really great question. You know, I don't know a lot about that, but I believe that some of my colleagues from UC Davis have been studying that and have found that bark beetle kill can contribute to more intense, more severe fires, which would presumably have, you know, potentially negative effects on plant diversity at low elevations too. In contrast, there's been some research from the Rockies in Colorado. Out there, they've found that bark beetle kill doesn't seem to really influence fire severity, but that's in ecosystems that already burn at high severity. So it's like, how do you get more severe than high severity?
Any research on the diversity of soil microbiome after intense fires?
Yeah, there are people doing that, and I think the general idea is it does really change it. You know, there's the potential for intense change, but I can't think of any studies in particular to go into more detail than that.
Let's see if there's any more. Are these scrubland monocultures doomed to die out because they burn so hot?
Well, I mean, the shrubs are going to be fine. We're not going to have a shortage of shrubs. That's one thing you can count on is, you know, if you come back to California in 100 years, there are going to be plenty of shrubs. I think the question is, are we going to lose, you know, our low elevation conifer forests in the Sierra Nevada? That's the open question. And the answer to that is it depends what we do, you know, in the next 10 to 20 years, probably.
What did you observe in terms of non-native plant species and different fire severities?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm glad someone asked about that. In, you know, where we were, there were not a lot of non-natives, and there was some cheatgrass in places. It was localized enough that it was not like clearly a big problem after fire. You know, in lower elevation ecosystems, like truly low elevation ecosystems, these low elevation conifer forests are not really that low elevation after all. But in general, it seems like invasives after fire are a bigger problem at lower elevations. We didn't really observe a lot of invasives coming in after fire where we were.
Did they burn hotter or anything like that? Or I heard cheatgrass burns pretty.
Cheatgrass, yeah, cheatgrass really burns. You know, I don't know how much cheatgrass was there before our fires, but I don't think, my guess from, you know, the limited abundance is cheatgrass was not a big part of the picture as far as fire severity.
Do you have any management suggestions for the sugar pines that you were concerned about?
Man. That's a really good question. You know, I don't know enough about that situation to say much, except I think the same kind of just general forest management, like for low elevation forests, thinning out the really dense stands and restoring prescribed fire. My guess is that's probably going to benefit the sugar pines too. But I would, you know, to really like come up with the plan for sugar pines specifically, I'd need to research that situation a little bit more. But there was a recent paper published by someone, it was either someone from, I think from UC Davis. I think it was Clark Knight from, UC Berkeley, who published that paper on the sugar pines.
Okay, I think that's about it. I think we've exhausted you, and you've given us some great knowledge and great presentation. We're so excited to have you every time. Your and presentations are wonderful.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot for having me, Bob and Eddie. It's really a pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, sorry I winked out there.
Hey, no worries. It happens to all of us in the Zoom era.
Yeah, I'm glad Bob was there to take on. Really appreciate you being here though, Jesse, and good to see you again. You filled a lot of gaps in my knowledge I didn't even know I had.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. Well, thanks for having me, and hopefully next time we can maybe meet up in person.
Are you going to go on any fire follower hikes?
I don't have any planned, but that could be a fun thing to do sometime this spring.
Yeah, I talked to someone who's a ranger or an interpreter at Sugarloaf in Sonoma, and he said the whispering bells are coming up right now.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
Nice.
Good deal.
Well, until we meet again.
All right. Good night, guys.
Happy trails, everyone.
And all right. Thanks so much.
On April 1st.
All right. See you then.
Thank you.